Hello again, folks. KR King here, helping you homebrew your own D&D campaign. So today I'm going to include another segment I did on the GM Roundtable in terms of inspiration. And in this one, it's about recharging your inspiration. That is, if you get burned out, if you're tired of being a GM, you're tired of having to come up with the storylines or run the modules, you're tired of dealing with the players, tired of having to organize play, what do you do to get yourself back in to enjoying the process of being a GM? Because if you're not enjoying yourself, if you're not having fun, it's not worth doing. So I asked these very experienced panelists, very experienced GMs about what they did to avoid burnout or to get themselves back. And I think you'll enjoy their comments. How do you stay inspired? How do you prevent that burnout?
Well, sometimes you can't. I got burnt out a few years ago. And the reason I got burnt out is I probably was playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, but that was part of the problem. But I'd also take on the commitment of being a Dungeons and Dragons Adventurers League coordinator for the North Island of New Zealand, which required a lot of travel. And I was running about 4 games in different game stores all around New Zealand, some in Hamilton, some in Auckland. And it's a lot of time, I mean, 3 hours in one direction, and then you run your game and you get back in the car and you drive for another 3 hours. And I did that for a year before I finally decided I'd sort of, didn't want to do that anymore. And then I started a YouTube channel, and suddenly I finding myself like, well, how do I keep up with that plus all of the other day-to-day life things? So I did get burnt out. So I don't know that you can necessarily stop burnout, because I remember watching like every single video that I ever put on YouTube and every bit of advice on the internet when I was feeling this way, like I just couldn't do it anymore. And it didn't help. It didn't really help, I was like, it's all very well when somebody says something or you read something, it doesn't really do you any good. In the end, it was really hard for me, because I remember my mum saying, Fred, you just need to stop. And I'm like, but I don't know if I want to stop. I like Dungeons and Dragons, but I don't want to stop. And she said, well, maybe you just need to stop being a dungeon master. And I was like, well, I don't know. I run a YouTube channel now talking about that sort of stuff. How am I supposed to do that? But I did. I did stop. It was, and what finally nailed it down in the coffin for me was actually a discussion I had with my mum, and realizing that I just couldn't do it. I couldn't stomach it anymore. And I took a 1.75 years, a year and a half off from just being a dungeon master. There was a space where I just didn't do any of it. I didn't play another role play game. I didn't do any D&D. There was a little space like that. And I just found somebody else who was running a game, and I just joined, and I was a player. And I could finally, I could be a bit of a bum. I was still trying to run my YouTube channel, which is weird. How do you give advice on Dungeons and Dragons as a DM when you're not actually DMing? Do you know what I mean? There's a whole period where that was taking place. And I would just be going back and like, okay, what did I do in the past? What can I say? And there's some very short videos on my channel that sort of look like that, where I'm sitting in the car, because I didn't know what else to do with myself. So yeah, I just had to sort of step back and stop. When I look back at it now, I probably should have just stopped the YouTube thing as well. That probably would have helped, but I didn't, because I was afraid that if I stopped, I wouldn't go back to doing it. And that was really what sort of got me through. There's a point where once you haven't been doing it for a while, for me, I don't know if it's going to work for everybody else, where I was like, no, I got to go back. I'm actually ready to go. Whatever's happened to me at that point. There was a point where I was like, okay, I definitely got to get back into this, because I miss it. Now I miss it. Before I hated it, but now I miss it. And yeah, I don't know if the journey for everybody's the same, but I've been there. I know exactly what burnout is like.
So, this is an interesting answer. It's weird. It's definitely weird. So, I guess to preface this, I haven't played Dungeons and Dragons as long as a lot of people. I've played it for 2022, probably like 4-ish years at this point. It's not super long compared to a lot of the knowledge that I have, but so far I don't really get burned out on D&D, and because I truly love the game. It's different for me. I'm not saying that, oh, because someone gets burnt out, they don't love the game. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just more so that is the reason for me personally and why I don't get burnt out. So for me, whenever I like truly love something, I can always find the pros to outweigh the cons of something or doing something. So for example, this is being the pros of being able to sort of put a smile on my players' faces to help them be able to really conquer their demons and all the sort of pitfalls of just everyday life, of them just having to go through the suck and being like, oh my gosh, this week was terrible, but this D&D game is the highlight of my week, and being able to provide that experience to them, to being able to really show them an amazing time and being able to give them those memories, then that's enough for me personally to make me motivated to be like, you know what? Hey, I can make some other people happy. Let's freaking do this. Let's go. Let's feel inspired to make other people inspired. And that's enough for me personally. Now, despite that, I want to also mention, I'm not like ridiculous. I'm not crazy. I do take breaks because, mental exhaustion is a thing. And by all means, that's perfectly fine to take a week, a month, or however long you need to do. But I don't necessarily get burnt out for an extended period of time for like months and months and months. It's never, D&D for me just personally hasn't ever been like, felt like a chore. It's like, oh my God, I gotta roll some dice, I gotta role play these characters. It never really felt like that because, like I mentioned before, the pros outweigh the cons, despite me playing 6 games a week right now, because I'm truly living the dream. I'm having a great time making other people happy. And sure, there may be a point where I'll, a year or however long, I'll get actually burnt out. But for right now, for me, we're living the dream, we're having a great time, and we're having other people have a great time. So that's enough for me.
So I've definitely battled with burnout a few times since I've started running games and even playing D&D. And, the two biggest sources for me of burnout are either lack of engagement with my players, like feeling like we're on the same page, I guess is a better way to put that. Feeling like there's a disconnect at the table between me and my players, or burnt out in terms of my own capacity to create the world and set the players up to engage with a story. And so, the first one I've discovered is a very simple solution of just talking to my players and having a 20-minute conversation before a session where it's like, hey, I feel like we're playing two different games right now. You all are clearly wanting to do X type of game. That's not really my strong suit in terms of what I'm interested in running. So where can we find a middle ground to where we can all be happy and engaged at the table? The second one is a much more fun answer because, like I said, I enjoy reading and I enjoy engaging with literature and fiction. And oftentimes if I'm feeling kind of in a rut when it comes to my capacity to storytell or world build or create encounters, I will intentionally go find oftentimes fantasy, sometimes sci-fi, but just some kind of genre literature from a culture that I have little to no exposure with. Because, being a guy that grew up in Oklahoma, very Western Eurocentric fantasy was just what was being thrown my way constantly. And it wasn't until I really got to my post-collegiate self that I started really engaging with non-Western European literature, especially fantasy. And so recently I've read Rage of Dragons by Evan Winters, which is set in a fantasy version of the southern African regions. And it's very compelling and interesting. Jade Empire is a modern fantasy take in a fictionalized version of Korea. Poppy War, if people haven't read that, is a much more traditional earlier era fantasy, but set in Southeast Asian type of culture. And these authors are either from or their heritage is derived from these areas. So you're getting completely different ways of telling stories, completely different archetypes and tropes and and modality of storytelling, and that can really engage the part of myself that's feeling burnt out and feeling like I'm having a hard time coming up with these things, and there will be these new elements that I can take and engage with and inject into my own game. And so that's my biggest thing, is just trying to shake up my own routine in terms of what I'm consuming, because we can only put out what we consume. And so changing the fuel can really get the engine going again. So that's what I do.
When it comes to burnout, I feel like it's one of those things, like Fred was even saying, like sometimes it is kind of unavoidable that it will just end up kind of like happening to you, and really you kind of have to like you really do have to kind of challenge yourself to like throw your headspace into somewhere you haven't been in before. But that's hard, especially when you're experiencing those feelings of burnout. You don't want to do those things, so it's like you kind of have to go against your own gut. Something that helps me when it comes to burnout is looking up different games and systems. My brother basically forces a lot of this on me because he likes to show me a lot of this stuff. But I'm actually, as much as sometimes like I'll be bombarded with some of these things, it is nice to see, because then it makes me kind of consider like, oh, you could run a game like that. That's really interesting. And I'll look at a system I've never heard of before, made by someone that I've never heard of before. And I'll look through it and be like, oh, this is really fucking cool. Like, where is this from? Who made this? Like one of these adventures, A Thousand Islands from Zedexu seemed really interesting. And from what Eric was talking about, differentiates itself from European style fantasy. I think it's Southeast Asian fantasy, made by a writer and artist that were in Malaysia and like the Philippines, I believe. And some of the concepts that are in there are really like things I've never considered before. And even though I've never run anything in there, or even really, I think we only really played like 1 or 2 sessions in there. Sometimes I'll look through some stuff, like not just that one in particular, but other adventures and game systems that have been shown in this way, to really kind of like jumpstart the engines. It also helps to follow a lot of people that, will on the indie scene of TTRPGs, because there's so many just different ideas that are floating around in that space, and it's really helpful to kind of help yourself out with making your own adventures.
For me, having played so long since the box set, I've gone through periods of burnout, and maybe that's why I'm asked this question, like, how are you guys deal with this? Because I've had periods. I was in college and my friends all wanted to play, and they were literally like failing. I said, I cannot play D&D 3 times a week. I'm trying to, and then I got out of college and they wanted to play, and I was always the perennial GM. And then I had 2 really burnout periods. One was I was playing 3.5, and I'm trying to keep up with my players. All these guys worked at JPL. They were literally rocket scientists. They were super smart. They had these min-max characters and feats, and it was just kind of, and I had to always come up with something, and I started to, and so I said, why don't you guys run? And someone would run, and they were like, oh, come on, Kevin, why can't you just run, And I finally had to say, I'm not playing. And I stopped. And then it's a long story. I had a friend who got sick and I started playing again. And then he died. And so I kind of got burned out as well. And then I was in Poland, I'm teaching, and I see YouTube videos, and I knew 5th edition was out there. And I got back into it. I came back to the United States. I went to this legacy comic book store and I just started playing with these very young people with this kind of a lot of critical role type of an attitude, which was totally just like, what is this? So I just kind of casually said, hey, I wouldn't mind running. They're kind of looking at me like, okay, grandpa, or whatever. But I started, and they, but fortunately, they liked it. They were excited. And suddenly and I found 5th edition much more manageable. I didn't play the 4th edition. I looked at it. I never played. But so for me, burnout was always just take some time off, do some other things, just play. But you know what? You're going to come back and you're still going to love this game, right? Because you loved it at one point. You just need that rest. And so I would say that to people, that if you're feeling that way, play some other game. Like we were talking about, read some other systems, read some other literature, and just give yourself a little break. But, I think, what Key was talking about, that you're still that rush of bringing joy to people is something that, as a DM, when things are going good, when Eric was talking about that great module, it was just craziness and fun and all that stuff. That's a that's a drug that, it doesn't affect your health. You might lose your job. No, but it's something that we all strive for. And so for me, that's what I had to do. I just had to take time off and do some other things. And I say that to people out there watching, that if you play a lot, it might come over you, this burnout. And so hopefully these are some ideas that will help people. All right, so there we have some different perspectives on burnout, some things you can do if you do get burned out, thinking about the things that inspired you to play D&D in the first place, to be a GM, and the things to remember when you're playing that can help you avoid getting any kind of burnout. So if that was helpful to you or enjoy my content, please subscribe. I'm always looking for more. Leave some comments. Tell me about some instances where maybe you've had burnout, how you overcame that. But most importantly, stay inspired and play D&D and tell somebody else about it.